Hey, it's Carm3D on the tube with you. This is another video for my students, although some of you lightweight people can get some knowledge from this too. This is gonna kind of go down to the basics of rigging, and also I'm gonna explain or cover the differences between the old style bones and the new joint bones, and as how this will apply to my students because they are going to be using Cinema 4D most likely. And also I want to let you know what's going on with my video editor. I cannot get that thing to work. I don't know what the deal is. It's just a crash fest. So I'm editing this video in QuickTime Pro, and so I don't have like the ability to do transitions or anything fancy. It's just very sharp, cold cut edits. So that's just the way it's going to be until I can afford to buy a new editor. Anyway, here I have a null object. I'm going to add some bones. In the setup tab here, add a bone, add a child bone, add another child bone. Okay. Oops. Now let's kind of sort of mimic a real world situation that we may see with bones. We'll have like a spine going up this way, and we'll have an arm going down here. Okay. So the basics here is that a child is always going to inherit the rotations of its parent. You can see that really, well, aside from this one, can't even select this guy. Yeah, even that one's skewed. So the only thing with a normal rotation is the null object, because it's parented to the world and it is in the same orientation as the world. I didn't rotate it or anything like that, because you can see how the axes move around as I rotate, and as I rotate them in certain directions, you got the two axes are going in the same direction, which is what we call gimbal lock. So let's put him back. Oh, I got auto key on. Let's put him back manually then. Okay. Now, you probably have seen in many of my videos what I like to do is make a child bone, a base bone rather, that kind of resets the orientation. So let's make one of those real quick. I'm going to clone this guy. I'm going to call him bone base. And he is the same size and position as the other bone, so you can't really see him right now. He's right on top of him. Oh, okay. Yeah, that was a mistake. There we go, and whoops. There we go, okay. I'm going to go into the bone properties here, and for this bone, the base bone, and put its wrist length way down. That's what, okay, this is what you've always seen me do. And what that does is it resets the rotations for this bone. This bone is a child of this little teeny base bone. and which I'll never use. It's just there simply to reset the rotations of this guy. So now I can rotate this guy anywhere I want, no gimbal lock issues. At least until I do something like that, but that's a whole other tutorial, which I actually kind of covered in my gimbal free arm rig video. So anyway, this guy's been reset. And I could do the same thing up here. I could even do the same thing up here, although I really don't need to, because this kind of a joint here, or a hinge, is going to be like, you know, rotating the elbow, which only goes in one axis, so you never really have to worry about gimbal lock when you're only rotating on one axis. Okay, so that's what I normally do, and I've been under the impression that, well, let me back up. This is an old school approach. This is what you used to have to do before a new feature was added called I don't even know if if there's a button for it, but the keystroke would be Shift R, I believe. Let's find out. That is not the keystroke. Darn it. Time to pause the video. Okay, I found it. It's right in here. Let me move the screen over so you can see. As you can see, the axis is back to normal, or normal for something that hasn't been rotated from its parent. Go into orientation, and it's record pivot rotation, so it looks like it would be Shift P. Of course, that doesn't matter to you cinema guys. Record pivot rotation. Let me go do that on this bone over here. You can see this one is off. Let's move this over here so you can both at the same time. Record pivot rotation. Boom. Okay. So that effectively resets the orientation, the starting place of this bone, for our default pose. And so you are ready to animate, and so you can go to any extreme from this starting point. And so that doing so negates the need for these little base bones. So let's go in here and get rid of this guy. Okay, you can see he's all screwed up now. And notice that doesn't have any effect on these guys, because these guys are only looking at the bone they are parented to, or null, or whatever they're parented to. These principles apply not just to bones, but to anything. Null objects, another object parented to another object. It's all the same. It's all animated the same way. Record pivot rotation. Boom. Okay. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because of the new bone type, which are joints. You can see right now they're called Z-axis bones. They were never really called that before. They were just called bones. But when joints came on the scene in Lightwave, they called these Z-axes, and the new ones are called joints. You can see I can choose one or the other. Now, as far as strictly Lightwave is concerned, you can mix and match these bones in your rig, which is great, because the Z-axis bones are a little simpler to set up for basic stuff, legs and arms and stuff like that. But if you want to do like facial muscles bones, then the joints are clearly more adept at that. So you can mix and match them. The only catch is any type of chain, like an IK chain, they all need to be the same type. Now for you cinema guys, you don't have that choice. You have to use joints when they added joints in Cinema, they removed the Z-axis type bones. And that's kind of a bummer, because I like these other kind of bones, these old style bones, better, because you just stick one bone in there and you can see it, you can see where it's oriented from, and you're good to go. Joints are a little more confusing, but once you know these principles that I'm covering here, you can sort of anticipate any issues. So let's turn these into joints and see what happens. Okay, now you see I turned the first one into a joint, and all it does is show up as a ball. Joints do not look like bones until they have another joint as a child. So let's select this guy, turn him into a joint, and now you can see it looks like more like a traditional bone. It's still not exactly like it, the bone. It's the old style bones didn't have a little ball at the end of it, but you know, it's more like a bone than it used to be. And of course, turn this into a joint as well. So if you notice, this rig that we had earlier is no longer sufficient, because you got nothing sticking out in this direction to you know, take care of the rest of the geometry out there. That doesn't exist, but this is just for example. So we need to add another child bone, or in this case we want to add a child joint. And there it goes. So it's nice and handy that it placed it in the right position. But the weird thing about joints are, weird one if you are not accustomed to them, is that these joints will always draw to their child no matter where you put them, and they always stretch, which is, you know, great for facial muscles, but they can be a little confusing until you really know what's going on here. Let's put these back. I tell you what, I'm going to open up my scene editor, go in here, and see, I think I can swap these back and forth from joints to bones, maybe. Maybe not. Okay, well, let's just do it manually. Of course, we have this new bone sticking out there that we didn't have before, but let's just ignore that for now. Anyway, with old bones, typically you would only want to rotate them, because if you move them, bad things happen. This will not look good once you have geometry in there. You know, his shoulder will kind of look like taffy or something like that when it breaks away. It'll get all stretched. So that's all fine and dandy. That was expected. But when this happens, although, you know, it's typically it doesn't happen ever, but you still can see the visual of the bone pointing off in the direction that it always has been pointing off of. It is not affected by whatever's going on over here. It's its own thing. And so when you hit rotation mode, yeah, you got your axes pointing off in the direction of the bone, but you also have a visual of the bone here. Now, let's turn these back into joints. So if I was to move this guy, actually I can't move him. Oh, there we go. I was selecting him here, but that doesn't work. You have to select the round dot. So if I move him, the bone is always, 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 as I said, going to flow into your child bone. The problem is, or at least the confusing part is that this guy is still pointing off in that same direction he was before. It's just not as obvious. Yes, you can see the little notches on the circle here, notch on the circle here, but you know, it's pointing off in this direction, so you just have to be aware that this bone is still going off in this direction. I mean, the axis of this bone is still going off in this direction, and the same rules apply that you always had to work with are still there. Now this thing snapped back because I don't have auto key on, but the rotation would be unaffected by whatever is going on over here if you were to move this thing. Typically you only move those with facial muscles, and not for arms and legs. So that's something to be aware of, and it might be a little confusing in cinema when you are building your first rigs, because, well, you want your joints, going up for the spine, and you're going to have joints going off for the neck, or I mean for the limbs. But if you place a joint out here and move it in place, this thing, if you didn't reset its rotation, do the thing I showed you over here, record pivot rotation, it's still going to be oriented sticking straight out, or the direction of the bone that it was a child of. So you will need to use the Cinema 4D equivalent of the recording of the pivot rotation, and we will get into that in a different video when I move over to Cinema, to have this point towards this. Now, I barely have used joints. I've hardly used them, so this may or may not physically orient the bone pointing to its child. So I don't know, I'm going to have to experiment with that some more, but what you may want to do when you are rigging in this manner with these joints is to have your joint, the child joint, going straight up, and then rotate this guy to bring this into position. And then when you move it along its z-axis to put it in the proper length, you know, finding the elbow, rotate it so it's lined up with the upper arm, and then move this guy until he's lined up with the elbow, and then add your second bone. It'll be going straight out, rotate it so it's lined up with the wrist, and then do the same thing, move this guy until he lines up with the wrist. I think that is probably what you need to do. We will both find out in due course. So that's basically my introduction to joints, and we will continue this discussion in the future.